In this example, we are given three different functions and we are asked to evaluate g of -1. Let's break down what that means. So here we have -1. This represents our input value. If we are thinking about this in terms of the vending machine analogy, that means we're pushing the button -1 and we want to see what snack pops out. And this variable helps us identify which function we want to be looking at. So it turns out in this example, two of the functions are not even needed to do this question. So we want to take -1 and we want to plug it into the g function. Now, if you're unfamiliar, these things are called absolute value bars. So what we want to do is g of -1 is equal to, we want to take -1 and anywhere we see an x in the g function, we want to replace it with -1. So I'm going to do the absolute value of 3 times -1 squared plus 3 times -1 and then an additional absolute value bar. So the way that we simplify this is we want to simplify everything inside of the absolute value bars using order of operations, and then we will take the absolute value at the end. So -1 squared is +1, so we have 3 times 1, and then we can multiply the 3 and the -1, and that becomes 3. 3 times 1 is 3. And then we get the absolute value of 0, which is just equal to 0. So our final answer, g of -1, is equal to 0. And that is how we would go about doing this question. Let's evaluate f of -1 and h of -1 just to see what that would look like. All right, so if we're going to evaluate f of -1, we are taking -1 and plugging it into our f function, which is this function right here, and anywhere we see an x, we want to replace it with -1. Okay, so let's do some simplification. We want to do the exponents first, so 3 times -1 cubed turns out to be -1. And then -1 squared becomes +1. So if we do some multiplication now, we get -3 minus 3, and then that becomes -6. So f of -1 is equal to -6. Let's go ahead and evaluate h of -1 now. Similarly, we want to plug in a -1 anywhere we see an x and see what that simplifies to. So -1 squared becomes +1, and then 3 times -1 is -3 plus 1. If we do the multiplication in the numerator, 3 times 1 is 3, and then in the denominator, -3 plus 1 is -2. And so finally, we find that h of -1 is equal to -3 halves. And that concludes this example.